So I'm absolutely delighted to be joining you today at the SSCP Forum Week. It's such an exciting agenda that you've got all week. I wish I could sort of take part in all of it. But really excited to be joining you today. My name's Gail Gibbons. I'm an assistant director at the Youth Endowment Fund, and I'm an assistant director for change for the children's services, neighbourhoods and youth sector. Which is probably the longest job title that anyone's heard. So I shall just start moving the slides. Right, okay. So I'm going to start just talking a little bit, not too much, about the Youth Endowment Fund, who we are and what we do, before moving on to the main topic that we're going to be talking about today, which is what we know about children's experiences of violence. So for those of you who don't know who we are, we were set up in 2019 as a What Works Centre. So you may know that there's a number of What Works Centres that have been set up in the UK, specifically focusing on different topics. The College of Policing, just thinking of colleagues have just spoken, is one What Works Centre. And the Youth Endowment Fund is specifically the What Works Centre for reducing young people's involvement in violence. And our vision is a world where no child becomes involved in violence. And our mission is to find out what works and to build a movement to put this knowledge into practice. So in terms of what we do, this is our strategy on a page. So we aim to work with 7 essential sectors. So our main focus is working with these 7 sectors, which doesn't mean to say we don't work with anybody else, but we focus all our work in these areas as far as we can. And probably no surprise to you, the sectors are children's services, education, health, neighbourhoods, policing, youth justice and the youth sector. And what do we do there? Well, we fund good work. So we fund multiple systematic reviews of evidence. So we look at what do we know already about what may work for supporting children vulnerable to involvement in violence. We identify evidence gaps and we also fund new evaluations and data analysis. So at any one point, we've got multiple projects, delivery projects around the 2 countries that we cover, which is England and Wales, specifically delivering projects, and we fund independent evaluators who will evaluate those projects to really support the evidence base. So we're particularly interested in funding projects where the evidence base is perhaps either non-existent or quite limited, or doesn't tell us too much. And once we find out what works, we've got an online toolkit, which I'll be touching on shortly in the presentation, where we summarise lots and lots of different interventions to really make it easy for yourselves as practitioners and commissioners and decision makers at local level to understand what you might want to commission to support children vulnerable to violence. For each of our 7 essential sectors, we also produce both practice guidance and systems guidance. So the practice guidance is aimed specifically at senior leaders and practitioners in each of the sectors. And the practice guidance and systems guidance are both based on the best available evidence in terms of their recommendations. Systems guidance is aimed at policymakers and decision makers. And we have a sort of rolling programme in terms of how we produce those and when we publish those. So we've got a number of those guidances out at the moment, and then we've got quite a few coming up in the next 12 months or so. And then finally, we work for change. So we do a lot of things like this. We do presentations, we do virtual learning cafes or webinars, we present at conferences, etc. We also engage closely with politicians and government departments to really share what the evidence is telling us, so that we can understand and lobby and support policy changes and reform system changes. Underlying all that is we do a lot of work directly with young people, and also with the different sectors. So we spend a lot of time getting out and about into different areas. I'm not sure if we've been to Somerset yet, but you might be able to let me know that later. So one of the things that we publish each year is what we call a Children Violence and Vulnerability Report. So the last year, our last one that we published was in November 2024, was our third report. And we recognised that actually we know a lot about the numbers of children getting involved in violence, the types of violence that might be. But what we didn't have nationally was a really clear picture from young people's voices themselves. So what are their experiences of violence? What are they telling us? So the real focus of these reports is to basically summarise what we do know about the prevalence of violence in England and Wales and children's involvement in it. And we obviously know that from things like police data systems and other research and reports. But we commission an independent, large-scale survey for children to complete themselves so that we've got a much richer and deeper evidence base. And the reason why we do this is to support people like yourselves to really understand what might be happening nationally. And it is possible to pull off data at more sub-regional level as well, so that focus can be paid in terms of how children might be best supported once we know to the extent that they are affected by violence. So in terms of background to the survey, as you probably know, different sources of data show different things about the nature of violence. And we've got a little graph there demonstrating that. So these are just 3 different data sets which show a sort of broadly in the same direction, but actually they look quite different. So we've got police data there, recording knife-enabled crime, hospital data on children admitted to hospital for knife assault, and then police data again for children cautioned or convicted for violent offences. And as I said earlier, the purpose of this survey is to provide robust national estimates of the number of children and young people affected by violence. So we're interested in both victims, witnesses and perpetrators to really understand which children are most affected by violence so that we can all focus our resources more effectively. And also to provide more information on the context we operate in and the sectors that support children and young people. As I said earlier, this is our 3rd annual survey, and each year we survey more and more children aged 13 to 17 across England and Wales, so over 10,000 children for each survey. And this was the first time we did this. Last year, we divided our findings into 5 separate reports. All of them are available on the Youth Endowment Fund website. So we have a report on the overall prevalence of violence, one on the effects of social media, one on gender and relationships, one on relationship to policing, and the final one on positive activities, youth clubs and trusted adults. So first of all, how common is violence? So overall, what we found from the survey is that a worrying minority of children continue to have direct experience of violence, that a majority are exposed to violence on social media, and that relationship violence is common for both boys and girls. And I'll be digging into this in a bit more detail in a second. So just to touch on what do we mean by violence, what are we talking about? So we use the following definition when we talk about violence. So by violent crime, we mean the use of force or threat of force against another person or people, e.g. punching someone, threatening someone with a weapon or mugging someone. We also include sexual assault, which is when somebody intentionally touches someone in a sexual way without their consent. So to start with, the worrying minority of children who continue to have direct experience of violence. So 20% of children who completed the survey said they'd been victims in the past year. 16% of children said they'd perpetrated violence, and 27% had been either victims or perpetrators. So in terms of total numbers, that's equivalent to 960,000 13 to 17-year-olds across England and Wales. And what we found in the survey is that most children experience more than one incident. So, and 61% of victims experienced violence that resulted in physical injury. And then 48% of those children who said they perpetrated violence say that it resulted in physical injury. And as you can see from the graph, more than once in terms of experience of violence, 65% of victims of violence had experienced violence more than one occasion. And as you can see, in terms of 2 to 4 times, 36%, and 5+ times, 29%. In terms of weapons, 5% of children surveyed said that they carried a weapon in the past year. And as you can see from the graph, the vast majority have said that that was some form of knife. Of that, 25% of those carried a screwdriver or other stabbing implement, and 23% carried a kitchen knife, which is particularly interesting given some of the dialogue in the media at the moment about kitchen knives and accessibility to kitchen knives, etc. The leading reasons children gave for perpetrating violence were baiting and retaliation. So, as you can see, for children, when they were asked why did you perpetrate violence, 36% there said that it was because somebody had annoyed, humiliated, or threatened them. So a sort of baiting, if you like. Really interesting question, or certainly the findings of this were really interesting. We found that most children who perpetrate violence do not receive support from their perspective. So perpetrators of any violence, only 39% said that they were in trouble with parents. And for those who were perpetrators of serious violence, 40% were in trouble with parents. Of course, the parents may not have been aware of their children's experience in violence. In terms of whether the police were involved, 10% for those of any violence and 16% for serious violence. And then, as you can see from the chart, other experiences could be school exclusion. 21% of children said that no adults knew about the violence. And in terms of support, just 10% of perpetrators of any violence said that they had received some type of support, and 12% of perpetrators of serious violence had said they'd received some support. Moving on to social media. In terms of those questions, 70% of all teenage children who answered the survey said they had seen violence on social media in the past year. And in terms of the platforms where they'd most likely seen the violence, 44% of those said they used TikTok, and 43% said it was from something they'd seen on X. And in terms of the question of whether platforms appear to be pushing content on children, 6% said they'd searched for violent content on social media, and 25% had said they had it promoted to them by the platform. So there's a lot here in terms of potential next steps in engagement with social media companies. 1 in 9 children surveyed said they had seen zombie knives or machetes on social media. This graph again shows the types of weapons seen by children who've seen weapons online in the past 12 months. So perhaps not surprisingly, the kitchen knife, 44%, followed not too far behind by a zombie knife or machete. And 2/3 of children who perpetrated violence say that social media played a role. There is not a huge amount of evidence in terms of the impact of social media on children's involvement in violence, but it is a topic, as you'll know, that's discussed a lot in the media. And there's an assumption that there is a relationship, and certainly from children who perpetrate violence, they would agree, and 64% of them say that social media did play a role in them perpetrating violence. Moving on to relationship violence. In terms of the children we surveyed, half of the children who said they were in relationships had experienced violent or controlling relationship behaviour. And I think, you know, I think we were quite shocked actually with some of these figures, that it was simply sort of shockingly high. So in terms of all controlling behaviour, 46%, but the most common type of controlling behaviour, in fact, 45% of children in a relationship, was sending constant messages to check up on what they were doing, followed by going through messages to see who they'd been talking to. 31%, sorry, of children who were in a relationship said they had also experienced physical or sexual violence. So to put that into a national context, that's 8.5% of all 13 to 17-year-olds. So who is affected by violence in terms of the demographics of the children surveyed? Overall, we found that younger children are more likely to say they've been affected by violence. We found that violence is experienced differently by boys and girls, and experiences of violence are concentrated among the most vulnerable. So younger children are more likely to be affected by violence. 47% of 13-year-olds who said they're in relationships have experienced physical or sexual violence, compared to 19% of 17-year-olds in relationships. And again, I think this is possibly surprising. Boys are more likely to be involved in violence, but rates for girls are high as well. So I think the assumption is that boys are more likely to be involved in violence, but actually the difference between boys and girls' experiences is not as vast as perhaps we might think it is. In terms of any violence, 24% of boys said they'd experienced violence, compared to 16% of girls. But if we look at the end of the chart, we can see that in terms of sexual assault, 6% of boys said that they had been affected, while 7% of girls said they had been affected. And relationship violence shows unexpected gender patterns. So again, just sort of carrying on from the previous slide, really, there are differences, but for some types and age, there's very little difference, particularly the older the child. In terms of ethnicity, there are differences in how children experience violence. So we've got on this chart a difference between a year difference this time between 2023 and 2024. So the difference between the last two surveys that we've completed. But what we really want to point out is actually looking at broad ethnic groups can obscure the results. So, for example, 13% of Black African children say they perpetrated violence, compared to 20% of Black Caribbean children. And experiences of violence are concentrated among the most vulnerable. So, for example, of children asked to hold drugs, weapons or money, 94% had seen violence on social media, and 79% of those in relationships had experienced violent or controlling relationship behaviour. And as you can see again from the chart, of those children who said they'd experienced violence, 48%, for example, had had police contact. 47% of them had had support by a social worker at some point. 32% had been persistently absent from school. 31% had got some form of special educational need. So this chart really shows quite starkly how those who are most vulnerable are also the most affected by violence. So how widespread are the effects of violence? What we found from our latest survey is that the majority of children feel the effects of violence. We also found that social media content impacts how safe children feel, and that some of these fears are putting them at greater risk. So we found that 2/3 of children are worried about being the victim of violence, and 52% of those say fears led them to change their behaviour or impacted their well-being. We also found that social media content affects their feelings of safety. So 80% of children said that seeing weapons online say it makes them feel less safe in their area. And 68% say that seeing weapons online say it makes them less likely to go out. So actually, being aware and concerned about violence is having some really stark effects in terms of children's behaviour. And some of these fears are putting children at greater risk. So of the children surveyed, 39% of children said if they'd seen weapons online, that it had had an impact on making them more likely to carry a weapon themselves. And 9% of all children say they've done things to protect themselves, like carrying a weapon or joining a gang. So what can we do about all this? And how should we or could we respond? Well, one of the things I wanted to introduce you to, and I mentioned it right at the very beginning, was the Youth Endowment Fund Toolkit, which is an online toolkit, very easy to access. It can be accessed from the Youth Endowment Fund website. And it's got 3 aims. One is to summarise research, making it accessible and actionable. Secondly, it's to support professional decision making with best bets. And thirdly, it's to create a foundation for change. So if you go on to the toolkit, we've now got, I think it's 34, 35, literally every couple of months we've added a new topic on there. You can click on to a different topic, a different type of intervention to support children affected by violence, and you will see something like this card. Sitting behind each of these cards, so if we took social skills training, for example, is some summary information, and sitting behind the summary information, there's detailed technical report and other information if you're really interested in getting into that level of detail. And for each of the interventions, we estimate the impact of the intervention on violent crime. So in the case of social skills training, the estimated impact is high, and the evidence shows that. We identify the evidence quality. So again, with social skills training, the evidence quality is very strong. So in other words, there will have been multiple high quality evaluations, which gives us really high confidence of the quality. And then we do an estimated low, medium to high cost per head. Just very briefly, a summary of the interventions that we've provided the information for so far in terms of grouping them of high, medium, low, indifferent and harmful impact. So this slide shows the estimated impact of violent crime interventions which are high. So that includes things like focused deterrence, social skills training, cognitive behaviour therapy and sports programmes, for example. In terms of moderate impact, we have things like pre-court diversion, custody aftercare and resettlement, relationship violence prevention and mentoring. For low impact, we've got things like after-school programmes, interventions to prevent school exclusions and parenting programmes. What I should say here as a caveat is what we are not saying in the toolkit is these interventions are not effective at all. What we're saying is that the evidence shows the impact in terms of violence prevention. So it may well be, and certainly is, that after school programmes, for example, can have a really positive impact. But actually, in terms of preventing violence, the evidence demonstrates that it's fairly low impact. We've got one here for no impact, which is street lighting. So it's sort of neutral in terms of the impact, but in terms of evidence quality, it is relatively low. There's not been many studies there in terms of assessing the impact of street lighting on violence. We've got a whole load of interventions where there just isn't any information, either no information at all or very, very limited information. And you'll see from this list that a number of these interventions are very widespread, very popular, and very highly funded. And probably there's a number of these interventions that will be happening in your area. But in terms of impact and evidence, we simply don't know if they work or not. One of the things that the Youth Endowment Fund is doing is we are funding some of these interventions to try and build up that evidence base and evaluating those delivery projects so that we can actually have a clearer position here in terms of whether these particular interventions have an impact or not. And then in terms of interventions which are demonstrated to be actually harmful, and the evidence quality for both of these is very, very strong. They are boot camps and prison awareness camps. So the evidence shows us that it can actually have a counter effect. It can actually make children more likely to get involved in violence. So that is just a slide which summarises everything on a page to just give you a bit of an overview. And as I said, we are constantly adding to this list and reviewing the topics that we've already got on the list because new information and evidence is coming through all the time. So future topics we've got planned. We are very close to publishing problem-oriented policing, a particular intervention called Communities That Care. We're doing an update on restorative justice interventions, and we have got topics planned for formal pre-court diversion and informal pre-court diversion. So I'm going to, I have brought a couple of questions along today, but I think I'll move those to the end. I think Steve has got the time open for Q&A at the end for us to do that together. But it would be great if we could hear from you in terms of, do you think the findings from the latest CVV report chime with you in relation to children's experiences in your area? And to what extent do you commission evidence-based interventions for children vulnerable to involvement in violence locally? So whether the toolkit is useful or also chimes with you in terms of your work. Finally, thank you very, very much for listening to my longish presentation. Please do take down the QR code, sign up for our newsletter, get in touch. We're always really delighted to hear from people and to engage in the conversation. Thank you.